Welcome to TYT Interviews. Michael Shure here. We have a fascinating guest today. We're going to be talking, especially in this, what is now in the era of the Trump White House dealing with the press in the way that they do. I think it's a special privilege because of that to welcome Margaux Ewen into our airwaves here on the Young Turks, because we need to tell the story that that her group is advocating for. She is with Reporters Without Borders. Margaux Ewen, thank you for coming on to TYT.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get a little bit of background to what Reporters Without Borders is, how it started, and what do you do every morning when you wake up and go into work?
So Reporters Without Borders was originally founded in France over 30 years ago. So our French name is Reporters Sans Frontières. So when we say RSF, it's kind of the international abbreviation of our organization. And we've been defending press freedom and access to information thanks to a network of local correspondents in 130 countries that report violations of press freedom and access to information on the ground. And we use that information to advocate for the release of journalists and bloggers, citizen journalists, legal reform, improvements in investigations into the death of journalists, murders of journalists, combating impunity, etc. So we do work all over the world, but of course I'm the Advocacy and Communications Director for our North America office. I monitor press freedom in the United States, Canada, and the English-speaking Caribbean. And I have to say that recently we have had a lot more focus on the United States in terms of press freedom violations, because things are getting much worse, as you all know.
Yeah, and that's true. And give us, because we don't know this, we know what's going on in the moment, but the sort of the scope of the history of it isn't as well known to a lot of our viewers or me. Put into perspective what this White House is like and what is going on now with other White Houses and with other administrations.
Well, I would like to first start by going back to the previous administration under President Obama, because it is worth noting that things were not perfect prior to Trump taking office, by no means at all. This is largely due to the fact that the Obama administration prosecuted more whistleblowers than any previous administration combined, so much so that it was going to a war on whistleblowers, and I think that that is a pretty accurate term. There was also a serious problem with transparency and access to information in the government that already existed prior to the new administration coming in. Of course, what we're seeing now is a complete escalation of press freedom issues in the United States, just merely alone from the attitude of the new president and his White House team towards the press, the language that is used against the press for critical reporting, treating the press as fake news, as also dishonest, inaccurate, second rate. These are terms that have been used multiple times by Trump and by his aides for reporting that doesn't seem to be in favor of the president. Of course, there's also the issue now with other members of the new government, like the Secretary of State Tillerson, who is not taking a press pool with him on an official visit to Asia, which is practically unheard of. And these types of limiting of access are much more pronounced than they were under the Obama administration, even though the foundation that the Obama administration laid was not a perfect one.
Okay, I want to get into some of the Obama things, but first I do want to start with this White House and the idea of fake news. To me, just those two words are an assault on the press. And how then, when your group steps in, you're advocates, you're not a journalist yourself, what do you do? How do you pick up that mantle and move forward with it?
Well, I think what's important to do is to point out the numerous authoritarian regimes in the world that have used the term fake news in order to crack down on independent reporting, have used it to imprison professional journalists or citizen journalists and bloggers alike. I'm thinking of about a month ago, a case of 4 journalists or several journalists in Ivory Coast who were being detained for supposedly reporting a fake news story or distributing false information about a corruption scandal locally with security forces. They were later released, but it is definitely not an isolated case. The Saudi Arabian blogger Raif Badawi, who is now doing a 10-year jail sentence for starting a liberal Saudi network online, preaching tolerance and communicating information to the Saudi people. One of the charges on which he was convicted was disseminating false information. And so it's very important that the United States, a liberal democracy, as we reveal ourselves to the world, doesn't give ideas to the authoritarian leaders of the world that are using this very term of disseminating false information to crack down on a free press that doesn't necessarily report on them in the way they would like to be reported on.
All right, and it's not even just that we are showing them how to do it. It's we're almost learning from these authoritarian regimes in some way. I mean, during the Trump campaign, I know because I was covering it, they put us in pens in the middle of every event. You were in a roped off area in a pen, and it's a little different than a regular press pen because you're right in the middle, and you had all his supporters screaming at you, giving you the finger, telling you it was fake news, chanting toward you. It seemed like an ugly throwback to something that we'd moved past, and that's why I wanted to talk about those differences as well.
So the pen, the restriction of the press to a pen in itself is really not a new phenomena, but I think what you're speaking of the hostility of the crowds at certain campaign events was so intense that before the Republican National Convention, many journalists underwent crisis training, hostile environment training to prepare for the worst during the Republican convention. And that is really shocking in the United States. I don't think that anybody would expect to require that kind of training to cover something like the Republican National Convention. And I definitely feel that the way that President Trump is operating is definitely trying to reach the people, American people, directly through his Twitter account. He doesn't give speeches like prior heads of state have given, and he seems to try and take advantage of the discontent from the American people, or a portion of the American people, with the press, to kind of feed this environment of bullying the press, labeling them the enemy, to take off attention from some of the very good reporting that's going on, revealing different elements of his presidency, conflicts of interest, what have you. It's a tactic that is very clear is being used to kind of feed off of this public sentiment, even though recent polling has shown that the majority of Americans still have more faith in the press than in the president himself.
Right, and may that stay the same. Let's go back a little bit to the Obama administration, because you were talking about that, and we should say that RSF, again, nonpartisan, only partisan on behalf of journalists and on behalf of the press, bloggers, and I want to ask you a little bit about how that works when you're called in. But let's talk about the Obama administration. You said or alluded to, this isn't a quote, but the fact that the Obama administration was tougher on whistleblowers than any other administration previously. It was unprecedented. How does that happen, and then what do you guys do?
So we were very involved, for example, in the case against New York Times reporter James Risen, who was being subpoenaed to reveal his source in a lawsuit against what the government assumed, who the government assumed was his source, Jeffrey Sterling, former CIA operative, regarding the book that James Risen published called State of War on the CIA. And that incident, which dragged on for many, many months, I think over a year, was very, very concerning for press freedom, because you had a reporter who was being pressured to reveal his source or could face contempt of court if he didn't reveal his source. Now, eventually the government gave up on pursuing this, but the person who was convicted, Jeffrey Sterling, was only convicted on the basis of metadata, that is the existence of emails and phone calls between him and James Risen, who he was in contact with for another topic, as he claims, and the fact that he was just basically convicted on circumstantial evidence, never proving that he actually revealed information to a journalist should be very concerning to every American citizen because it is a very low threshold to convict someone of espionage, which is a very serious crime. And Jeffrey Sterling is now serving a 3.5-year prison sentence, has always maintained his innocence, and RSF has considered him a whistleblower because he actually expressed his concerns about a CIA operation to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. But he paid a very high price for following legal channels and was convicted of giving this classified information to a journalist, but on completely, entirely circumstantial evidence.
And so RSF then, what was their role and what was your role, but the group's role in that case, for example? Where do you fit into the legal process? Do you fit into the PR process? How does it work? When do they pick up the phone and call RSF and say, hey, yeah, I have a situation here?
So we always work with the journalist first, deciding what they would like us to do. And obviously, if they have legal representation, we work with the attorney because there are certain things that we would prefer to be publicly visible in terms of public relations for, or public advocacy, I would say, for a specific journalist facing legal repercussions. Right. In the case of Jeffrey Sterling, since the James Risen case was before I was with RSF, but I can tell you that with Jeffrey Sterling, it really was about elevating his story to the journalist community and connecting the plight of whistleblowers, those that follow proper legal channels, and those that actually pay the price for a story that's later published by a journalist, to make sure that he was not forgotten, to make sure that his story was told, and why this was a concern for the journalist community, that someone who was just in contact with a journalist could be in prison for it. And so we did a lot of public events in Washington, D.C. We held 2 press conferences. We brought in other whistleblowers who had either been prosecuted or who had taken plea deals to kind of go over what their experiences were. We had Cornel West come in and talk about Jeffrey's case as a great ally. And we started a petition along with other organizations, partner organizations, because we're always stronger in numbers. And we petitioned President Obama to pardon Jeffrey. We delivered the petition to the White House. And so we did a lot of awareness raising on his case because I think that it was not as widely told as the case of James Risen. And we thought that the American people needed to know how this could affect them and how this could affect their access to information.
Right. What if, in a hypothetical, if Breitbart came to you, right, and a group that is not just journalism but really advocacy journalism, position journalism, and sometimes is challenged. I'm sort of tiptoeing around my feelings about them, but if they came to you and they said, hey, we're having a problem because we're not getting access to the Democratic National Committee right now, what does RSF do in that case? Is that the kind of thing in which they would step in, even though it's the players, or am I giving a bad example?
Well, we haven't as yet been approached by Breitbart or another publication of that type regarding access concerns. And I would say just in general that all press should have access. It's not about choosing which ones get access over others. Right. That is very harmful to the First Amendment and not something that RSF would ever get behind. But during the campaign trail, there was a Breitbart journalist who claimed that she was manhandled violently by Corey Lewandowski, and we did put out a press release on that aspect, condemning that treatment that she underwent during a campaign event just for trying to ask a question. Yeah, it's the Michelle Fields case. It's important to really take a principled approach. And like you said, we actually don't really focus so much on the quality of the journalism, but on the freedom of journalists and media to operate, to get access, to be able to cover campaigns or a presidency without restriction.
Understood, and I think you're talking about Michelle Fields was the reporter who was
Yes.
thrown down by Lewandowski during their, or I don't know, thrown down, but grabbed and manhandled, as you said. Then let's talk about internationally. The case that comes to mind is the Al Jazeera case, Peter Greston and these and his colleagues who were imprisoned in Egypt. They were tried. RSF stepped in and really advocated in that case. And I think that's the kind of situation that a group like yours is needed. How does that work? And what are the results? What are the victories at RSF?
So I think because we're an international organization known around the world for our work defending press freedom for over 30 years, we can help elevate the conversation on a specific case, bring it to an international scale and bring visibility to a case that may not be as visible before we intervene. And so we really pride ourselves on helping journalists who are facing lawsuits that could put them in prison for doing their job. It's something we do on a daily basis. Just to make a parallel, there are about 10 journalists right now that are still facing criminal charges for their coverage of protests in North Dakota. So that's in the United States. And the important thing is to make sure that those cases are, those charges are dismissed, that those journalists are not swept under the rug, that the fact that they're facing charges in the United States of America for covering a protest is not forgotten. But this does happen internationally as well. Every time there is such a case of a journalist being prosecuted for simply reporting, no matter what the government in that country says the charges are, RSF really will step up to the plate and make sure that international organizations that we're working with, international bodies, are aware of the case and that the pressure is on that government, on that legal system to withdraw charges and stop prosecuting journalists for doing their job.
And yeah, I think just pointing towards that, when in the office, when you're sitting around having coffee and shooting the breeze, when is the high five moment? What are some of the things that when RSF has a victory, what sort of paint a picture of what that is like?
So I remember vividly when Mohamed Fahmy was cleared, who was also being charged with Peter Greston, and that was an amazing moment. Any good news is excellent news. Another victory was when Khadija Ismailova was released from prison, an investigative journalist in Azerbaijan, and that was a collective effort with many international American press freedom and human rights organizations, and we were all just overjoyed that she was released, and it happened to be just before her birthday. So there are a few moments where there are good news, and when they happen, you have to really take a moment to celebrate them, but also use them as a motivation for any upcoming battles that that you're involved in, to kind of just put it into perspective that it is possible. Advocacy does work. It is becoming harder on the international stage at the moment, especially with the United States taking kind of a back seat to denouncing abuses against journalists and the press worldwide, as they had done in the past. But I still think that it's worth reminding oneself of victories for freedom of the press in general, because if you don't remind yourself of that, it's very hard to move forward in the growing crackdown on press freedom that is occurring over the world.
Yeah, well, that's just the disappointing thing, isn't it? With the United States that has been a leader in this sort of thing for so long and looks at other democracies, oligarchies, monarchies, and can't believe what is going on in other countries. Now we are not very dissimilar from a lot of what's going on there in the way that the press, you said the United States has taken a backseat because they seem to have put the press in the backseat, or not at all in the case of Tillerson, who's not even putting them in the back of the plane, and which is an amazing thing, isn't it? When you think about a Secretary of State traveling abroad with no press and saying, of course, that it's to save money when it doesn't. It actually helps them because the press pays to get on that plane. It actually saves money to allow the press on the plane, which to me is the most egregious thing that came out of all of that. Well, maybe not the most, but it was fairly egregious. What do you do now? Like, do you go to the State Department? Do you get a group together? How do you protest something like that?
So protest of something occurring at the State Department, which I would say did not happen really frequently under the previous administration. We worked very closely with the State Department and several officials in the Department of Human Rights and Labor that were very effective and very cooperative about raising concerns of journalists being prosecuted or being restricted in their profession in the countries in which they traveled to, and in public statements, but also in diplomacy and diplomatic meetings behind the scenes. Now I think we are always open to work with the State Department, but it seems that they are still transitioning to getting all of the employees instated at that higher level in terms of political appointees. But just to have the State Department not make its annual human rights statement is very concerning, because it sends a message that we're no longer observing other countries how they respect human rights, and that includes freedom of the press at the very forefront, and that is alarming. Furthermore, the actions of our own government against our own press send a specific message when the Secretary of State travels to China without a press pool. What kind of message does that send to the Chinese government? China is the largest prison in the world for both professional journalists and bloggers. So it's just sending the worst kind of message to a regime that cracks down heavily and severely on anyone who reports independent information that doesn't toe the Communist Party line. If our own Secretary of State doesn't show that we have a value of a free press, a strong value for the free press in America, and the First Amendment is the absolute ideal that we hold ourselves to, then honestly, it's very alarming, and we should be very concerned.
And in response, are you seeing that news organizations are going to figure it out on their own? They're going to get over there. They're going to cover the hell out of this thing, or do they cower in situations like this where they don't have an option because they're not going to get the access once they get there?
Well, I don't think that we can say that a press organization that can't afford to arrange their own travel, that they've essentially already paid for pool access, and the argument that it's saving money not having them along with the Secretary of State. I don't know where that argument comes from, right. But there are financial limitations to many outlets today, and I don't think we can impute that to journalists as a lack of courage or hunger to cover this news. I think that the American press right now is definitely been invigorated by the attacks that it's facing. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't need access to be improved, and we don't need our Secretary of State to take the journalists along with him on official trips. But I would say that the press is really fighting to have access and to cover the news aggressively. And I would say that they're really doing an excellent job.
And are there I say cases, but are there times that RSF has been asked to step in where they said, actually, no, I don't think that's for us? Or can you give us an example, if not specifically, generally what that would be?
Well, typically, like I said, we defend freedom of information. So that means that citizen journalists or bloggers that provide information, and that act of providing information is directly tied into why, for example, they're imprisoned, that will be a case that RSF will take on. Where it becomes a little bit trickier is if someone wears multiple hats, if they're also an activist, if they're, for example, an independent writer, or they also work in politics. It's really about finding the causal link between why someone is being prosecuted, why someone is being arrested, harassed, what have you, and their activity of reporting information or communicating news to the public.
You are a superb advocate for your group, an ambassador for your group, and you're not a journalist. Why is a group that is representing journalists and representing leakers and representing sources, and why have they? I guess the question, and I'm forming this as I'm asking you, Margaux. Why have they decided to operate the way they have around this Trump White House is what I'm asking. I guess why are we not hearing more about RSF in the press? Why do we not see so much about it constantly now, especially in light of the Trump White House and the way that they've treated the press? I'm frustrated, not with your group, obviously, just in general, that people are not more irate about this. And I guess the real question is, your group, because they exist and everyone's so grateful that they do, are they responsible for making sure that we all know this story in some way?
Well, yes, of course, we try to communicate about these restrictions to the press as much as we possibly can. That is the point of awareness raising and advocacy. And I think there are a lot of American people who may not be aware. They maybe are aware that the press are being blocked access, but then they might say, well, why does that interest me? And I think RSF, our job is to really make those people understand that it directly impacts them, that not having facts and not having truth reported can be a matter of life and death. And I'm talking about, for example, the Flint water crisis. If that story wasn't reported, there could be people drinking water that is deadly and they wouldn't even know it.
Right.
So it's just one example of why it's just so important at the very level of average Joe American to know what's going on in their own country, in their own community. But I would also say that awareness raising can be hard in the 24-hour news cycle, and when there's a vicious cycle of Trump saying something against the media, and then the media kind of saying, well, look, we need access or we need this and that. I think that it's absolutely on the part of President Trump a tactic to detract from all of the reporting that's going on his ties to Russia or on his former security advisor Flynn's purported lobbying for Turkey, which is Turkey, as we all know, is a huge press freedom crisis right now. So many journalists are in prison. It's now become the world's largest prison for professional journalists, and our own representative in Turkey is currently on trial for terrorism charges because he participated in a solidarity campaign with the Kurdish Daily. So there's a lot that we have to do to continue to bring this issue to the American people. But I have to say that's the day-to-day work of RSF in the United States is to communicate this to as many people as possible.
Right, you're kind of the wisest commenter in the comment section in a way, and you're the person who is reacting to, or the group that's reacting to what's going on. There's so many stories that we could tell, but I think that I speak for a lot of people when I talk about how grateful this is advocacy in a way, but you're advocating for a profession that I am in, so everyone is really grateful for the work that you're doing. If people want to find out a little bit more about RSF, Margaux, how do they do that?
So you can follow us on Twitter. Our English language Twitter account is RSF_EN. You can also visit our website. That's en.rsf.org. We have every press release that we publish around the world on different topics, and you can even check by country. We also publish an annual ranking of 180 countries based on their press freedom record. Just to point out, in terms of awareness building in the United States, the US ranks 41 out of 180 countries, which you might be surprised that it's so low, given that we're the country of the First Amendment. Yeah. And I just want to say that we will be coming out with our 2017 Press Freedom Index soon, so I would watch for that. Given that the events of 2016 were very volatile, as we all know, during the campaign trail.
So do you know, and you're not telling me where we placed in the next one?
I am not at liberty to say,
Okay.
but I have to say that observing the trends, it's not looking very good.
It's not looking very good. Yeah, no, I figured as much. 41 out of what was the number out of 100?
180.
Yeah, out of 180 is astonishing in a country where the First Amendment, like you said, is so vital to how we function and what our Constitution, Bill of Rights is. It's just incredible that we're at 41, and I'm guessing 41 is going to be our best in the last 2 years. But I'm just looking at, kind of reading the tea leaves that you're sharing here. RSF is Reporters Sans Frontières, is that right? Pretty good?
Reporters Sans Frontières, yeah, you got it.
I didn't get it really, that was much better. But Peter Gabriel had a song called Games Without Frontiers. When I was younger, I'd listen to that, and there was French. Frontiers is one of those French words you hear for a long time when you have no idea what it means. You also had a chance, Margaux, by the way, to say Côte d'Ivoire, and you went with Ivory Coast, so I appreciate that.
Of course, my pleasure.
RSF, a really important group. Look them up, RSF_EN, which is their @ for Twitter. Margaux Ewen, thanks for your time. Thanks for being on TYT Interviews.
Thank you for having me.